I guess I'll hold it back a little bit. How's that? Too loud or okay? Okay. So my name is Lori Taylor Blitz, and I'm the director. Very quiet now. I'm the director of the Beaver Island Historical Society. This is my 5th year as director, and thank you very much. Museum Week could have been a little bit intimidating this year, since last year was a skip year. I thought I lost all of my skills, but thank you for sticking with us and coming out for Museum Week. Tonight, well, let's go through a couple housekeeping things first, though. Miles will be signing books after we're done, and we do have a few copies left available. And we will pull that side door open, and you can go in there, and there'll be a seat where he can sit down and sign your books for you. Okay. And so Museum Week, all of our events are free. We do ask for free will admissions. That, you know, keeps us going and lets us keep up with the tradition of having a fantastic Museum Week each year. I have a beautiful bucket that I bought from the boat shop this year, and I'm going to put it at the back of the room, and you can just drop a donation into it on the way out if you're able to do that. And as you're in here, you probably noticed this is a new edition, and we put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into it, and it's turned out fabulous. What you're in right now is phase 2, and so we're advancing on to phase 3, which will be working in the historic core of the building. And to help us finish strong, the last leg of it is selling off these raffle tickets. And I've only got like 25 left. There were only 400 tickets is all we have printed. The drawing for this is at our annual meeting in less than 30 days. It'll be on August 19th. Now, a lot of you might live here, some of you might be visitors. If you live here, this is a great gift to give the people who want to come and visit you. If you're on vacation, this is a great way to come back if you win. But if you win, you get 4 days, 3 nights stay on Beaver Island, which includes, that's lodging at the lodge. You get round trip airfare for 2 from Charlevoix. You get, and I don't think anybody can really cram all of this into it, but you have your choice of a guided tour from the tour company, free rental of kayak, paddle boards, or bikes, a private tour of the museums and both lighthouses, a picnic lunch and a home dinner. It will be prepared and brought out to you. A sunset or island cruise, so you could get a sunset with Paradise Bay Mike Weed, or you could get a sunset cruise on Lake Gennesaret. We will provide a use of a vehicle, and you will get an island crafted souvenir from Potter Larissa McGinnity. So all of that for only $25. So, I mean, if somebody's got a birthday coming up between now and August 19th, give them a great gift. So with that, I would like to introduce Miles Harvey. He is a professor at DePaul University in Chicago, a professor of English, and also the author of this best-selling book, King of Confidence. Probably one of the better Strang books that I've read. So with that, welcome.
Can you guys hear me? Yeah. All right, good. That way I don't have to hold the microphone. So, first of all, it is just great to be here for obvious reasons, and maybe one reason that's not obvious is my book was released a year and a week ago, and I've done innumerable book events on Zoom, and they were wonderful, but this is my first live event, so it's in the kingdom, you know. I have a few things in the book that are a little bit new to the Strang story, both on the plus side and on the minus side. But I'm sure I'll learn some stuff for you here. I was telling Maury, you know, this is an intimidating audience. You know, a lot of people I could tell, you know, James Strang was, whatever, a juggler in a circus, and they would believe me. But here I know I'm talking to some people who really know their stuff, especially about the island. So it's very exciting for me here. Anyway, I thought we'd start with this guy, and I'm only going to read a couple of short excerpts, very short excerpts from the book. But I thought we'd start with this guy because I kind of want to put you in the time period. I think James Strang was very much a person of his time, and that time was the antebellum period before the Civil War. And it was a very strange time. There have been massive disruptions in society, right? Technologically, you've got the telegraph, which changes space instantly, fundamentally changes space in the way that, like, Zoom does now, right? I can do my lectures and my book events on Zoom, but this put people who are hundreds of miles away in simultaneous communication. You've got the photograph, which freezes time. You've got the railroads, which just fundamentally changed the way Americans move around the country. And you've also, because of the Industrial Revolution and a number of other factors, have this really, demographic shifts in the country where people are really moving around, right? They're not just sitting on their farms that their parents were sitting on, and they're moving around the country, they're doing new things. So it becomes this nation of strangers, right? And as a result of that, there's a trust gap, for good reason, because people are taking advantage of the trust. So when we look at Strang, I think a lot of us think, well, how could that guy become the leader of what we now call a cult? And how could he influence so many people? How could he get so many things done? I think there's a lot of reasons for that. But I want to talk about one of them. I think he had and exuded confidence, which in this period was really important. So I'm just going to read you a paragraph now. Although James Jesse Strang was physically unimposing, a few inches over 5 feet, and bald, with an oddly bulging forehead, he did possess one distinguishing feature: his dark brown eyes, which one acquaintance described as rather small, but very bright and piercing, giving an extremely animated expression to his whole countenance. Another claimed that those eyes seemed as though they could bore right through a person. But more than any tangible attribute, Strang possessed an invisible, ineffable aura called confidence. And in those days, before electrical power, confidence was what made antebellum America hum. Confidence was black magic, good fortune, and hard cash combined. Confidence could turn worthless paper into glittering gold, cow towns into cities, empty lots into bustling businesses, losers into winners, paupers into millionaires. Confidence was a charm deployed by bankers and merchants, philosophers and politicians, clergymen and card sharps alike. Confidence was the soul of trade, in the words of one leading financial publication. Without it, added Herman Melville, the great novelist, commerce between man and man, as between country and country, would, like a watch, run down and stop. In an age before the federal government began printing paper money, an age when you had to trust in privately issued banknotes, glorified IOU, confidence was the de facto national currency.
Hey Miles, will you unmute your microphone on Zoom?
Yes. Muted on Zoom?
Unmuted.
Oh, unmuted. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was unmuted.
Oh, then I think you lost your...
Okay, let me get back to Zoom. Lori, I'm sorry. I must have
That's
got...
okay, I'm sorry.
All right.
Filling up and back and they have my sound.
All right. Launch meeting, open meeting.
Okay.
Great.
Just
Yep.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. Oh, wow. Christian, it's like rock and roll. Oh, great. Yeah.
Okay.
Uh,
Technology.
yes, I can hear my echo back there. It's fantastic. Okay. Strang would appreciate that. Wait a minute. Strang, what are you doing?
Good.
You got it. You got it.
Okay. Okay, I'm getting something different than you. Are you just seeing Strang?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good enough, yeah. Great. Okay, that looks good to me too. All right. So I want to just talk about where Strang came from. He came from this part of Western New York, basically all of Western New York, that they called the burned over district back then. And they called it that because so many religious fires were pouring through there. It was just like a really intense, mostly these Protestant religious fires, but these kind of revivals like we're seeing on the screen now, where people were just ecstatic. But there were also all these great social movements. And they come up, the Erie Canal was just built, and they sort of, it becomes like this vector of ideas as well as of transport. And so this is a time when, and a place where the women's movement is really getting started. The anti-slavery movement is doesn't start there, but it's burning hot there, right? But there's also all these quirky prophets, like singular people, but also like spiritualism, like that's where spiritualism gets started. Also where the Mormon Church gets started, right? So Strang comes out of this, and he's like a really interesting guy because his parents were Baptists, and he was like raised very much in this church. They were very much true believers. But one of the things that was so lucky for me and for other researchers on Strang is we have these diaries of him from the time he was about 19 to I think about the time he was about 23. And they're fascinating. He writes in code. Code, faces, masks are big to him. Deception is big to him, even then. But in code he writes two things. And we see both sides of this guy. We see this opportunistic side, right? And this idealistic side. And on the opportunistic side, he writes, when I talk about religion, people really listen. They're really into it. I really can speak well and excite people about religion, right? But then he also says, I'm a total atheist. I don't believe in any of this stuff, right? So you've got these two sides of him from the start. And I want to talk tonight a little bit about both the opportunistic and the idealistic side, because I think they're both real. Opportunistic side maybe a little bit more real. But so Strang was he was a country lawyer after he grew up a farm boy, poor farm boy. By country lawyer I mean simply that he, like Abraham Lincoln, and there's a lot of comparisons between these two guys, starts his life as he studies with another lawyer and gets his law degree that way. So he didn't go to law school. And he does that for a while in the burned over district. And you can see in his correspondence he's already into deception and, oh, that money didn't arrive, it must have gotten stolen. Oh, well, I'll send it again, and sort of misleading people. Then he lost most of his business as a lawyer. He became a newspaper editor. And he only ran a few issues of this paper. I gotta say, like as a writer, I really respect Strang. He's not like a stylish writer, but he's a really good propagandist, right? And I think that really helped him. And he was also a postmaster, which was a big deal in that time. It's a political patronage job, so Strang was a Democrat. He lost his job when the Democrats lost the presidency, right? But it's also the way communication moves through the country. It's like the internet times 10 is the post office. And so Strang learned all these skills that came in really handy. Well, he had to leave Western New York. He sold some property that didn't exist. And, or allegedly sold some property that didn't exist. He always denied it. But then the guy who bought the property that didn't exist came back and said, well, that doesn't exist. And so Strang had to fly by night, as they used to say. So he literally, according to newspaper reports at the time, faked his own death. And this was not uncommon, right? In this age, yeah?
Please, you need to unmute your microphone on Zoom.
Okay.
They can't hear you.
I need to unmute it again? Okay.
Yeah, you got muted.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Okay, no, we'll be back to that.
There we go.
Okay. I don't know why that unmuted. Okay.
And we might have to share your screen.
Okay. All right.
you go. Now you can share your screen on Zoom too.
Oh, on Zoom too? Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, is it shared? No, all right, I'll share. Hold on. That's easy enough to do on the college professor. That's really funny. I was teasing my friend who's a big Twain fan. No, that's terrible. Okay, we should take it out. All right. Okay. Share screen. Okay. All right. How we doing? Okay.
Well, we've got the picture on Zoom now, but we don't have it on the monitor.
All right. Okay. How's that?
There you go.
Ah. Okay. All right, great. So, I was talking about the burned over district, and I was talking about how Strang had to get out of there. And where he went was a little town in what was then just barely part of the U.S., just been taken from Native Americans, was the Wisconsin Territory, Burlington, Wisconsin, which is a green star on this. It's a little town. I just was there this week, which I'll tell you about later. Hour and a half northwest of Chicago. And Strang joined some Mormon friends of his from New York out there. And he became a lawyer again. And he was still at that time, by his own admission, a total atheist. He ended up going here to Nauvoo, Illinois, which was on the banks of the Mississippi River in Illinois, in western Illinois. And it was, by that point, the home for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was a city of about 10,000 people, which when you think about that in the early 1840s is stunning. As big or bigger than Chicago, a really amazing place. Well, Strang went there and converted to Mormonism. The great question, which I have no answer for, is was he serious? Some of his associates later said, no. This was part of the fraud. He thought he could get some people, he and his friends thought they could somehow connect themselves to the church and get some people to move up to Burlington to start a little, well, Nauvoo was in trouble then, right? Those of us who know the history of this church, which has played such an important role in the American saga, know that right when Strang joined the church, the pressure on the church to leave Nauvoo was intense. And eventually, in 1844, Joseph Smith, the founder and prophet of the church, was murdered in western Illinois. This is a picture of his murder. And a few months later, Strang claims that Joseph Smith made him the head of the church. He produced this letter, which you can see, it's online. You can see the real thing as I did at Yale University. It's basically a letter from Smith to Strang saying that, basically you're in charge of the church. Now this is crazy, or at least unlikely, right? We don't know. It would be kind of like making a private in the Army the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, right? This guy who just joined the church, no rank, and sort of like, I think you're the guy, so. But it was a forgery, modern experts think, but it was also a very good forgery. Strang was a good writer. But he also knew how to manipulate the mail. And part of the stuff that the people were accusing him of fraud at the time, which just helped his case, they were accusing him of something that was probably wrong, and he came back and said, no, it's right. And here, I'm right. And so that proves everything, right? So he instantly, Strang was an incredibly industrious person. Whatever else you think about Strang, he walked like 200 miles and started meeting with Mormon leadership, and they told him to go away when he produced this letter. They're like, okay, thanks, bye-bye. But he kept going, and eventually, in that town of Burlington, Wisconsin I showed you, he dug up some brass plates, or his followers did. He stayed away. He had a dream, an angel came to him, a vision. They told him to dig on this hill. I was just out there this week, this hill of promise. He dug up some plates, and this is a drawing of what the plates look like, an etching of what the plates look like. These plates, as you can see there, were written in a language unknown to humanity before this. Right? Two things were really lucky for Strang. One is that only one person in the world had the ability to read this language. And he happened to be living in Burlington. And his name was James Jesse Strang. So he took these things that Strang was, this was an imitation of what Joseph Smith had done, right? Where he did up the golden plate, right? But I think to a lot of people in this really turbulent society, this was very appealing, right? This idea of, oh, there's something bigger than my immediate life. There's something really exciting going on here. And so things went on for Strang. I want to talk about the times for a minute. These two guys are not often pictured together. One is the political philosopher and founder of socialism and communism, Karl Marx. And one is P.T. Barnum, the great, we think of Barnum as a circus promoter, but he was that was at the end of his career. He was famously like a professional hoaxer, right? And so Marx talked about, in the Communist Manifesto, which comes out in 1848, Marx, whatever else you think about his ideas, really diagnosed what was going on in this world. He wrote these famous words, everything that is solid melts into air. This idea that people had all over the place, that their lives somehow weren't what they had thought they were, that things were changing too fast, right? And I think Barnum is a guy who says, yeah, that's right, everything that's solid melts into air. He was kind of a professional hoaxer. So, for instance, he had this museum in New York which was wildly popular called the American Museum. And he displayed this, right? So this is, Barnum would display this as a mermaid, right? And let's say you guys all came to the American Museum that day. Several of you might say, that's not a mermaid, that's a monkey sewn to the tail of a fish. Barnum would say, yeah, maybe it is. Why do you bring your grandmother back and see what she thinks? So Barnum, in that world of everything that is solid melts into air, he sort of embraced it and said, yeah, things are really not real. And what's the difference between fake and real, right? And so there's, in 1848, when Marx spoke those words, for instance, there were apocalyptic fears all over the world. There's revolutions in Europe, these huge revolutions in Europe going on. And there's all these sort of doomsday prophecies, right? Also, people started seeing sea serpents at this time. There were regular reports of sea serpents, which brings us back to James Jesse Strang, who in the Northern Islander published up front here, one of the first things he wrote about was a sea serpent he saw off Beaver Island. So, that's something that I've not seen anyone write about before. It may have just amused him. He may have been making fun of all the other spottings of sea serpents, or I think he may have been giving himself. So the book of Revelation has some stuff that's important to the Mormon church. Some of it has to do with serpents. I think he may have been sort of giving himself extra credit as a prophet. Because one thing you have to remember about the people, the true believers who came on Peter, is that they thought they were ushering in the coming of Christ, right? Here on Beaver Island, right? And this was going to, they thought they were going to change the world. So, in addition to the true believers, and he had people from all over the world, a lot of the Mormons who came here were from Nauvoo, and it was destroyed after Joseph Smith's death. And Strang attracted some leaders of the church who were blown away by him, who really believed in him. He attracted a lot of people who were afraid of moving west, because what Brigham Young did after Smith died was absolutely incredible. Brigham Young literally was leading thousands of people into a wilderness where this stuff was not only not on the maps, Salt Lake, the maps were wrong at that time, the federal government maps, so what Young did was incredible. But Strang also attracted a lot of con men to come with him. And this is not one of them. This guy is Charles Dickens, and this is the second little section I'm going to read to you. Because I think Dickens came to this country in 1843, and he visited Cairo, Illinois, in my home state, which was then a lot like Beaver Island or whatever. It was this growing community, but there was a lot of fraud there. And some of that fraud had been perpetuated on English people. They're like, come to this paradise in Cairo. And they bought land and they got there and it's like, oh, what is this? This is a swamp, right? So this really interested Dickens. And Dickens didn't love us Americans, but he did make some shrewd observations about us. So I'm just going to read you a very short paragraph of his about this one guy who was committing real estate fraud. The following dialogue I have heard 100 times. Is it not a very disgraceful circumstance that such a man as so-and-so should be acquiring a large property by the most infamous and odious means, and notwithstanding all the crimes of which he has been guilty, should be tolerated and abetted by your citizens? He is a public nuisance, is he not? Yes, sir, came the response. A convicted liar? Yes, sir. He has been kicked and cuffed and caned? Yes, sir. And he is utterly dishonorable, debased, and profligate. Yes, sir. In the name of wonder, then, what is his merit? Well, sir, he is a smart man. And Dickens was fascinated by our seeming attraction to smart men. And I don't know if this is an American thing or not, but there were sure a lot of smart men at this guy actually never made it to Beaver Island, but in Strang's camp. This was a guy named John C. Bennett, who was one of the great frauds of the 19th century. He started his career as a medical doctor, and he had absolutely no qualifications to be a medical doctor. He was a classic quack doctor. One thing he did that was really interesting was he promoted the healthy benefits of tomatoes, and he turned out to be right about that. He went around the country, but he also promoted the healthy benefits of many things that would probably poison us if we drank them today. So he also had no military experience, but became not only the mayor of Nauvoo once he joined the church, but also the head of this very big military, Mormon military. And then he was kicked out for basically sex crimes in Nauvoo. Polygamy was a known secret among the leadership, but this guy was not delicate about I think we would not call him a polygamist, but we call him other names. So he eventually came to Strang. And this is a guy, this is your guy. This is a picture I found that I don't think has been published anywhere. This is a guy named George Adams, who was a Shakespearean actor / prophet of Strang's church, and before that the Mormon church. Notorious drunk. He would go around the East Coast recruiting for Strang. He'd do Richard III on one day, and then preaching for Strang on the next. People made fun of him. I think the New York Times called him, one of the worst actors ever. His clothes were reputed to be, or his body odor was reputed to be so bad that when another actor lent him their costumes, they had to burn them. There's a famous story that made headlines worldwide. It's the guy who published. He did not like this picture, Adams, because it makes him look like a font. It makes him look like just whatever. And there was a this was in a great Boston newspaper with a really funny editor, like a lot of 19th century editors, who made great fun of Adams. Adams tracked him down in the streets of Boston, horsewhipped him. This made headlines worldwide, and then announced where he was playing in Richard III that night as he flogged the guy. And actually, I gotta say, the guy came back pretty good at Adams right after he'd been flogged, so I don't think Adams necessarily got the better of him. Adams is also interesting for something that you're interested in. He had a long career after Strang. Eventually, both these guys broke with Strang. But Adams got the attention of this guy, Mark Twain. Much after the Beaver Island colony, Adams started a colony in Jaffa, in what's now Israel, in the Holy Land. A bunch of Americans followed him there. It was very much like Strang, only way more deadly in certain ways. This colony did not do well. A lot of people died. And in Innocents Abroad, to my mind, one of Twain's great books, is a nonfiction book about his journey to the Holy Land. He met some of the survivors of this colony on the ship, and Twain wrote about Adams at the time, not very complimentarily, in not very complimentary terms, but he also, at least one scholar argues this, and I think persuasively, Adams wound up as the king in Huckleberry Finn. If you remember, the king went around, he's a con man who goes around doing little hack theater, like Shakespeare performances, while conning people. And at one point, they talk about, do you do religion? You know, like, is that just as if that were one of the cons. So that's a little interesting sidetrack. Here is one of the other great con men. Some of you no doubt know about this guy. This is Strang's nephew and private secretary, you would introduce him as. This is Charles J. Douglas, my private secretary. Douglas, as you can see, this young man posed for a photograph when he was traveling with Strang. And he traveled with Strang not just for a few days or weeks, but months and months, while Strang was recruiting people in 1849 and into the, now it would be 1849, on the East Coast. Well, Charles J. Douglas wasn't Charles J. Douglas. Charles J. Douglas was Strang's first plural wife, so he had another wife. Charles J. Douglas was named Elvira Field, and it was she was secretly married to Strang, and she went around the country dressed in men's clothes. Did she fool everybody? No, she did not. Many people at the time said, "Why is Strang going around with a woman dressed in men's clothes?" A lot of people didn't, and a lot of people couldn't believe that. I think they didn't want to believe it. They wanted to believe Strang, right? And he was very good at getting people to believe things and not to believe their eyes, right? So eventually, Elvira Field came back, and she and Strang and the rest of the group moved. This is where I should put, you are here. Moved here to Beaver Island in 1850. He had been establishing a colony before that. The colony took hold, as some of you know, only very slowly. It was, a lot of people would come up here, some people would come up here, and I need not tell some of the people in this room, winters on Beaver Island are not for the faint of heart, should we say, or at least the people who don't like cold weather. And so Strang had a hard time establishing the colony, but eventually he decided to move his operations full-time from this town of Burlington in southern Wisconsin down by Milwaukee on this map and up to Beaver Island. I think there are a couple reasons for that. In Burlington, it's a beautiful little town in the prairie. It's at the juncture of these two beautiful rivers. One problem was that his followers could leave, so people would come and they'd be like, "Okay, I'm not buying this guy," and they'd leave. But his enemies could stay, and many of his enemies did stay in that town. He had attracted some top people from the church, including one of Joseph Smith's brothers. But some of these people stuck around and really made life miserable for him. And so I think he decided, I need more control on Beaver Island. Beaver Island, it was kind of more of a hub than it is now. And as many of you know, the business was lumber. So if you look at this map, the way to get from Detroit to Chicago, the railroads weren't there yet. So you had to go up and all the way around through the Great Lakes, right? And Beaver Island had a lot of lumber, and that's how a lot of the steamboats, almost all the steamboats originally, were powered. So you'd stop here to refuel. So out here would be huge piles of logs. And I tell you that because it's sort of the end of the Strang about that in a minute. So in 1850, I love this picture. It's from The Emperor's New Clothes, Hans Christian Andersen, which if you read the book knows comes out pretty much around the time Strang declares himself king of earth and heaven. And I think there was a certain amount of that. You know, if you read the accounts of the coronation ceremony, not far from where we're sitting, it's in this half-finished wood tabernacle that is like a log cabin, and it's not even finished. And they're literally using like George Adams and Bennett. These guys I showed you were masons, and they're using stage props and masonry symbols. It's again, for a lot of people at the time, it must have seemed comical. And there's some good eyewitness accounts where even people who want to believe are like a little bit like, really? You know? But Strang's followers were true believers. And lest we think, and I know a lot of people in this room have no worries about that, lest we think that declaring a quasi-independent kingdom on Beaver Island seems absurd to us now. Like, come on and get us, U.S. government, you know, like. Millard Fillmore, the President of the United States, who this is, took it very seriously, as you know, and he sent in the U.S. Navy's first Iron Hull warship, the USS Michigan, to invade the island. Strang gave up and urged his followers to give up. And what's incredible is he was hauled back to Detroit for this trial, as many of you know, and Strang won. He was found innocent, and he and his followers on the first set of charges. The federal government dropped the case after that. It was a bad prosecution, clearly. They could have got him for poaching federal land of trees, because this was mostly federal land then. But that wasn't a sexy charge, so they wanted to charge him with, you know, making false coins and with counterfeiting and other more sexy crimes, and they failed. And so, in 1853, Millard Fillmore leaves the presidency as one of the most undistinguished presidents in U.S. history, and King Strang is still in power. So the other thing about the island was, and I think my book advances this, you know, in pretty solid ways, is that Strang was running a pirate colony off the island. Here is a headline from the New York Times at the time, right? So there were these charges that Strang would send his followers out on schooners, and they'd show up in places like Chicago, and they'd come in with guns, and they'd rob stuff, and they'd leave. Also that he was sending out, there's just tons of contemporary accounts from the time of this stuff. Also that he sent out these rings of horse thieves. And horse theft was a big deal. Like we think, like, what's the big deal? It was a big deal, right? It's like, I don't know, stealing tanks or something now, right? These were like very expensive, and it was a huge crime and a huge problem. And so in my book, at least one previous author has claimed there's nothing to this. It's a smear. Strang was a great guy. It's all anti-Mormon smear. There was a lot of anti-Mormonism. Let's not overlook that. I'm sure some of it was a smear. But in my book, I pinned down cases where people were arrested, went to jail, were from Strang's colony. They were known to be from Strang's colony. The one which I appreciate you noticing, we got a Strang expert in the room. You really got that Perrysburg thing. This case in Perrysburg, Ohio, where one of Strang's top lieutenants, a guy by the name of Jonathan Pierce, is caught stealing horses, and he's put in jail. Strang and a bunch of other associates show up to town. There's this great local newspaper editor who's like very funny, among other things, and he's saying, well, you know, I don't think he's here to watch the trial, you know, for just to show his support, you know. And so the guy is convicted, but it's overturned on technicality, and the local papers are full of like the sheriff did some stuff, and they're basically saying the sheriff's on the take. So Strang doesn't go to the state penitentiary; he stays in his local jail. And what happened? Oh, there's a jailbreak, and the local newspaper editor said, I don't think they're going to catch Strang, you know, like, so that places him really at the scene of the crime, right? And so I think the bad side of Strang is very real. Were there some Did some people overstate the case? Sure, some people overstated the case. But the good side of Strang is real too. As you know, Strang was elected to the Michigan State Legislature in Lansing. Did he get in on fraud? Yes, he did. This is one of the registered voters on Beaver Island time. Napoleon Bonaparte, who was a hero of Strang's. And I don't know if he voted, but he's on the list of people qualified to vote on the island. You know, I mean, Bonaparte got sent to islands. It's not, but not this one. Right? So Strang gets elected by fraud, not once but twice. But he gets to Lansing, and he's like, even his worst critics are like, this guy's really smart. He's really good. And Strang fought hard for the rights of African Americans. He was a committed abolitionist. I say in the book, it's the one thing I'm sure he was. And I talk about in the book how I think he got there. From this incident he had, I can talk about it afterwards, early in his career as a lawyer, where he went to Virginia and he saw slavery firsthand, and he wrote home a letter about it and said, you know, this is just terrible stuff. And so when Strang gets to the Michigan legislature, he's a Democrat, and in his second term, that's when the Republicans come in. That's the thing Michigan history is you know, very proud of, the start of the Republican Party in Jackson. These are these mostly abolitionists, but definitely for the rights of African Americans who come in, they take both state houses and the governor's mansion in one election. And Strang votes with them. And he votes, and he gets up on the floor of the legislature and argues for 2 hours at one point on the rights of African Americans. And he helps get passed this thing called a personal liberty law, which is undercuts the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act said that slave owners and slave chasers can come up here and come up to as far as Beaver Island. Strang at one point offered free slaves to come to Beaver Island. I don't think he did, but he was offering. The idea was that in this fugitive slave law, you can come up and you can get your slaves. And what this law that Strang helped pass said is, yeah, you can get your slaves. Can't use our jail. You know, because people would say, oh, I've caught this escaped slave in Lansing. Here, I'm going to put him in jail, and I'm going to go down to the tavern for a while. It's like, no, you're going to, if you catch him in northern Michigan, you're going to walk him home with no help from us, right? So Strang was just, I think, absolutely an abolitionist, and it did not help him. The Democrats did not embrace, the Republicans did not embrace him, and the Democrats shunned him for this. So there's one thing that I think Strang did, which was not very calculated. There's a great thing that I found in the Northern Islander. It's by this guy. You can find it online. It's by a guy named Fred Douglass. That's what Strang identifies him as. This is Frederick Douglass, the former slave and great abolitionist, one of the most important men in American history, or most important people in American history. Strang publishes this excerpt from Douglass's autobiography, just recently published autobiography. I couldn't find this excerpt in any other newspaper in the country, so I think Strang sat there and arranged it himself. But with everything with Strang, it cuts both ways. So this excerpt is about when it's okay for a slave to steal from his master. So I think to the people on Beaver Island, that would have read like, because a lot of them believed, they knew they were stealing from people, but they thought, you know what, we're bringing around the second coming, right? We don't have time for your little local state laws about theft. That's not, like, those horses, I know you're upset about that, but we're bringing about around the second coming, right? So I think to him, to those people, it would have read like, oh yeah, of course, we're morally justified in what we do. So everything with Strang cuts both ways. Okay, sorry. So another way Strang was very progressive was Pantaloons. As some of you know, so Pantaloons were, like masks have been in the past year or two in this country, this political issue. In 1851, this woman named Amelia Bloomer, one of the great early women's rights advocates, starts wearing these things that look like this. They're not shocking to us now, but they were shocking then. And almost a year earlier, women are wearing them on Beaver Island. And so Strang eventually orders all women on Beaver Island. They become this touchstone for the great battle on Beaver Island, this like Pantaloon War, right? So, but I think it is very much like masks, in like Pantaloons are pantaloons, but they're not pantaloons. They're a symbol. So I think Strang's supporters, the women who support him and their husbands, they would wear the pantaloons, and his enemies wouldn't. But eventually Strang said, you will wear the pantaloons. There was increasing revolt on the island. A lot of it had to do with polygamy, too. A lot of Strang's supporters on the island were anti-polygamists. He had pushed himself as the big anti-polygamy prophet. He said, I'll never, ever do that, and then he did it. So by the end, he had 5 wives. But there, as you know, there was a plot against him, almost certainly involving the state of Michigan and the federal government. And in 1856, right out here, he was shot and killed by a couple of his followers. This is his house on Beaver Island, which he later expanded because he had such a big family. He was taken from the island to Burlington, Wisconsin. And this is a picture I took this week in Burlington. He was taken off the island. The island, as you know, was pretty much wiped out by the anti-Strang mobs. I have to tell you a story about this. This is the house Strang supposedly died in, his parents' house, and I think it is that house he died in. I'm there, I'm on a kayaking trip in Burlington, and my friend and I go to some of the sites, and there's this 20, 30-year-old kid out mowing the lawn in front of this house. And I say, because the map I was looking at was a little unclear. I said, is this the house where Strang died? He goes, yeah, that's what I've heard. I said, he goes, yeah, I just rent the place, man. And I go, am I the first person who's asked that? He goes, no, sometimes people come by. He goes, yeah, my boss told me it was a crazy story down here. He said, yeah, one time I come here, there are these people from New York, and they're walking around the house, they're in my backyard, they're out by the barn. I mean, I got my UTV in the barn. He's like, well, that's just disrespectful. We asked him if there were any ghosts. He goes, no. And we said, is it nice in here? He goes, not really. So, that's my report from the field for you. Here's me in front of, that's in my kayaking uniform. Me in front of the Strong, so when Strang was killed, the Strangites were forced off this island in the most brutal and awful way, stripped of all their belongings. People who saw them just put on boats and told to go. So just all their food, money taken away. And he never named a successor, so there was no followers to him at that time. But there's still a small Strangite church, and this is their church in Burlington. There's some Strangites in Burlington. You can see, if I blew that up, it says Strang at the bottom. It says Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and then it says Strang, so the Strangite brand. And I've actually met at least one. Well, I've been in communication with a few of them, and met one who's a really nice guy. But the church still exists a little bit. So that's James Strang, and I thought no, I'll save the next slide for last. But I thought while Strang watches over you, I would welcome any questions, comments. I have a feeling I'm going to learn from you as much as you can learn from me. But yeah.
What prompted you to write the book in the first place?
So I would love to tell you that. About 5 years ago, 6 years ago, my agent either called or emailed me to say an editor from Little Brown, this big New York publishing house, wants to talk to you. And I'm like, okay. I'm not going to turn that down. As Kristen can tell you, that doesn't happen that often, where someone kind of comes. And when they had in the past, it was always like, there was one where someone said, you should consider ghost writing this book, or it was some corporate leader. I'm sure he had led a fascinating life, and I'm sure I would have done a terrible job with the book, so I didn't even throw my hat in the ring. But this guy read at least one of my earlier books, The Island of Lost Memories, and he liked it, and it turns out behind the scenes, my agent had done a little prying. You ought to talk to him about this. Anyway, he said, yeah, take a look at this guy. I think you should write a book proposal. and I'm really interested in publishing the book. I can't promise anything, and so 100-page proposal later. But I knew from the start, I mean, it's a really interesting thing. I've been writing since I was, it's pretty much the only thing I do well. Because my wife is back there somewhere, can tell you. I'm a slow writer, and I usually find my way to the material. In this case, I knew really early on. I mean, I think there, as some of you know, there's at least 3 really good, I think, good books about Strang before. But in some ways, I think those books, and in fact, Vicky Cleverly Speak, when Lori had me in for a Zoom thing a year ago, Vicky Cleverly Speak, who wrote a wonderful book on Strang, happened to be in the Zoom audience. And so it turned out like she and I kind of answered questions together. Those books, more or less, and I'm not diminishing them by this, treat Strang as this footnote to Mormon history, or this footnote to Michigan or Midwestern history. And I just saw him as this lightning rod for all the crazy enthusiasms of the mid-19th century. And so I really wanted to place him in the context of his time. And partly because I think it's a time a little bit like ours, where truth is porous and flexible. Yeah. So that's a great question. But I got lucky. It's a short answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions or comments?
Could you comment on the Book of the Law that Strang wrote and how that fits into your interpretation?
Yeah, I mean, he wrote this book called The Book of the Law of the Lord. I think it was him firming up a power, and it was sort of, one earlier writer called it, sort of this totalitarianism prequel, right? It sort of puts him in charge of everything. But there were other things that were very interesting about that, and you can read it online. There are 2 versions of it, a shorter version which was published and a longer version which has been published since his death. It was ready to go. They actually had to put it on boats to get it off the island. It was being printed when he was killed. But one of the interesting things about it, Strang understood the importance of the environment. So there's this real stress on regrowing trees on Beaver Island. He understood that you couldn't just, clear cut on Beaver Island. You had to build things back up. And so, like all things with Strang, there's this intelligence. I mean, I just would say in general with Strang, he's wonderfully complex, which made him so much fun to write about. He's contradictory, like the most interesting human beings, right? He's not all one thing or all the other. So, in the same way that this asserts his control over private life, public life, it also has these things you think, wow, that's really ahead of his time, So, I mean, Thoreau was there. I mean, but he also read a lot, so he's interesting that way too. Yeah.
Your last sentence in your book is this: "So it is that the King of Confidence lives on."
Yeah, I mean,
let me ask you a question. Ray, would you be willing to read the last paragraph and then comment on it?
Sure. I mean, it's. I don't mention. So there's an oblique reference to twice in the book. I didn't want to write a book about our own times, but I think our own times, which wherever you stand in the political spectrum, I think you'll think we can't agree on truths. I mean, I'm a liberal. I have an old high school friend who's a QAnon guy, and when we discuss stuff online, the conclusion is we don't agree on, it's not really have a different idea about taxation. We have a different idea on reality, right? And so I think that my writing this book during this time informed the way I thought about Strang and vice versa, right? So it's Elvira, the woman, and some of the other wives. So 4 out of Strang's 5 wives were pregnant when he died. It's really a tragic thing. And Think Cleverly Speak, who I was really influenced by the way I track these women. That book is great. And those women led really rough lives, but also really interesting lives. But they thought that Strang was going to come back from the dead, right? And they waited around for him to rise, and he didn't. But people like James Strang never really vanish. When the time is right, they reappear, wearing new guise, exploiting new fears, offering new dreams of salvation. Americans are fixated on such figures, especially in periods of profound social and economic upheaval. And so it is that Elvira's desperate hope for her husband to return from the dead has come true. So it is that the King of Confidence lives on. And my point in that is just that I did want to somehow, I didn't want to write a book about our times, but I did want to acknowledge that I was living in a kind of times, and that I think this, you know, I do think what Dickens said, I don't know, there's comment everywhere, terrible comment everywhere, but there is a kind of American like of the smart man. I don't know, I just, that Dickens thing really stuck with me. Yeah.
So then, what do you think James Justice Strang would do if we were alive today?
I don't know. So, my best guess is I don't know, some kind of social media stuff. I mean, honestly, that's a great question I've never been asked. But so I write in this book about how Strang used, what he did was nothing short of incredible. He used what was then, it's the 19th century version of the internet. There was this system through the U.S. Post Office. You could exchange newspapers for free. So there was this exchange paper system. So early on, this is the telegraph coming in. Strang didn't have a telegraph here, I don't think. I don't think he did. Anyway, he could have. But these exchange papers, early on people realized, wow, this is going to change America. This newspaper boom, small towns are getting newspapers. Wow, all of a sudden, you know, you can do something in Washington, D.C., and people will know about it on the frontier in a few days or a week. Strang realized it worked the other way. You can do something on Beaver Island, and people all over the world will soon know that. He was a very good writer. He knew how to write a human interest story, right? So he would write these stories about Beaver Island and the growth of Beaver Island and the great leader Strang in the Northern Islander, and other newspapers would just clip them out and run them. Sometimes without comment, without any identification of where it came from. Sometimes even sarcastically, but Strang didn't care. He really understood that to get his name out, and he really understood how to do it. So social media, I think that's what he did. Yes?
5 pregnant wives. What
Four,
about
I think.
4?
5 wives, 4 pregnant.
What about descendants?
There are some, and I've been in touch with, on social media, I went in touch with someone who claims to be a descendant. I talked to someone, I was doing an all-night, one of these big AM all-night radio shows, what's it called? In Case Punnet's the host. But anyway, it's got a huge listenership at 3 a.m., which boggles my mind. But I talked to a guy who claimed to be Strang's great something grandson. There must be. I mean, I wasn't. You know, I was less interested in the genealogy than in the story, but I'm sure there are some.
We're out there somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, and some of his, one of his sons turned out to be a horse thief himself, but also a guy who had a big heart, and one newspaper said, you know, this guy's good and evil all in one. And I thought that kind of spoke for Strang too. Yeah. Yes, and that.
Was there much accusation going on about the connection between him being in town when Joseph Smith was assassinated?
He wasn't in town.
Or
I don't think
responsible?
I don't think people thought he was. I think people thought he was too small fry to be in on Joseph Smith's assassination. And anyway, those were anti-Mormons. It wasn't from inside the church.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I think that the shocking thing about Strang is that he would claim to be the leader of the church, you know.
It just seemed like he stepped in right at the opportune time to.
Right. No, he was, you know, brazen about it. And you know, the other thing about Strang, there were other, as those of you who know Mormon history know, there were other competitors after Smith died. But it really, Strang was probably, I mean, in 1853, that much later, Smith and his people were worried that Strang would be named governor of Utah.
Wow.
Yeah, so I talk about that in the book a little bit. I mean, I think here's the thing. Brigham Young, when he first came in, said, hey, I'm not a prophet. I'm just a great technocrat. I can run this church. And he was a great technocrat, right? Strang understood, no, people want a prophet. He's like, that guy? He's a mere mortal, you know? Good at figures, you know? You know what I mean? So I think Strang had that appeal. But I've never, I mean, there may be some, I don't know if there was, the people who shot Smith were, I don't know of any charges that they were working on behalf of any Mormons. I mean, that was, you know, ugly religious persecution. If I will say that because of that guy, the guy who looked like Napoleon Bennett, that comment, he had managed, and Abraham Lincoln gave him a lot of credit for this, to lobby the Illinois legislature to give Nauvoo this quasi-independent status. So Nauvoo also became a home of a lot of thieves and some of them Mormons, others just like, this is like our little refuge, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Miles, would you repeat the questions? That would be helpful.
Oh, if I would repeat the questions, yeah.
And I have a question.
Okay, great.
Some of the other authors that have written books about Strang talked about who the disciples were on Beaver Island.
Yeah.
And what kind of feeling did you get after your research? Who were these folks that moved to?
Yeah, you know, I talked. Thanks. Who were the people? So I mean, I think that there were a lot of people who were just true believers, and you know, as a person of faith myself, I don't question that. I think Strang may have been very attractive to them. I think some of those people knew they were committing crimes, and as I said, I think they thought they were doing a just, righteous thing. Other people on the island were just straight up, you know, kind of. But even like you asked, you know, did Strang and Adams, the guy who led that colony to Jaffa that Mark Twain wrote about, did they believe this stuff? I mean, one of the things I think about Strang, and I think it probably was true of Adams, it may have been true about Bennett and some of the other conmen who were on this island. I think it's possible to both believe yourself, to know you're lying, and to believe yourself to be telling a righteous lie. Right? Like I think Strang was a narcissist. I mean, that one I can almost say for sure. I mean, it's boring to psychoanalyze people from the past. There's no reason, right? He's much more interesting than a case study, right? Like that's what I love about him is that. But I think we can say pretty much clearly if you read his letters that he's a complete narcissist. You know, and he's got this brother who's like, wow, this is insane. You know, so these letters back and forth about how I'm going to become the greatest person the world's ever known. No, you know, just farming here in New York. That sounds crazy. Yeah.
Did you find any sources on actually who came in and exiled the Mormons? What was the makeup of that group and what actually happened?
Yeah, there's a fair amount. It was a mob, so people weren't taking names, but there may be. I don't know that I did not. That's a great question. So who were the people? So after Strang died, there were two attacks. One sort of final apocalypse on the island, where the Mormons were just forced off in terrible, you know, the scene from a bad, you know, Western movie, right? Who was the makeup of that mob? I mean, Strang had made a lot of enemies in the area. So, I mean, one of the interesting things about the dynamic on this island was all three groups were sort of involved in the island, were outsiders in mainstream American culture, right? So you have the Mormons, who were certainly vilified and picked on. Anti-Mormon sentiment and prejudice and hatred was, you know, it's shameful. There were the Native Americans who had signed over the island in this area, and were still here. And at first they, you know, sort of aligned with Strang a little bit. They got off the island, and that was discarded on them. If I'm remembering right. And then there were these fishermen, and a lot of them were Irishmen, Irish people, who survived the potato famine and were desperately poor and were exiles themselves. And so you had these three sort of out-groups. Strang didn't make any friends anywhere along the lakes, but with these fishermen, they hated him. And the US government increasingly hated him and the state of Michigan. Partly because he was running a scam where he was claiming a bigger population on the island than was here. It's for someone like me doing research, one of the questions is, my editor kept saying to me, how many people were on the island? And I'm like, okay. You know, you've got figures of 1,000, 500, 1,500, 2,000, 2,500. I'm like, those were all things people claimed, right? I think it was closer to 500. But Strang would get money for school children from the state, right? So he had a lot of enemies, but I think also mobs are just, we don't know mobs. I mean, we just, they're ugly and awful, and sometimes the people involved are just doing it for fun, right? Yeah, yeah.
How did he become aware of Beaver Island? The second part of the question is how would Adams have been attracted to Jaffa? I mean, how did they even find out about Beaver Island? The people today in the United States have never heard of Beaver Island.
Well, so it's interesting. So Strang, in one sort of second-hand account, Strang saw Beaver Island from a steamboat and said, "What?" This would be my promised land, right? But probably you knew about it. That guy Bennett, the guy who did the little Napoleon shtick there, he was trying to buy Beaver Island before Strang's visit. What Strang said was, he wrote these great things in this sort of 17th century English style, dust, you know, like this is great. He wrote these things, his revelations sound like King James Bible, but he was visited by some Native Americans who said he will go north to find, but I don't, you know, whatever, if maybe it happened, but we can't document that. Like I said, you know, Beaver Island would have been much more in a way known then, because to get from the east to Chicago, you would have probably gone past Beaver Island and you might have stopped here. Certainly, people who sailed the lake for various reasons would have known about it. And so, as far as Jaffa goes, I think Adams and Strang both did have religious feelings. I mean, Adams is an incredible contradiction. He's this notorious drunk who's going around making a lot of money, arguing, preaching against the use of alcohol, right? So in a way, and for those of us who had loved ones with addiction, we know how that goes, right? But and one day they can be saying, never again, this is the worst thing ever, and then the next day it's like, oh, today I wanted to drink. Yesterday was a bad thing. But that's, I mean, I think both of them did have this belief not only in this notion of bringing on a second coming, but also in their own role as a prophet, right? So, yeah, the question, I'm sorry, again in the back, the question was, did Adams and Strang really believe in their own cause? And I think the answer is a mixed one. Yes and no is the answer. That's it. Yeah, Christian.
I was really struck by a lot of the firsts that surrounded Strang, like you mentioned the bloomers and things like that. Can you talk about some of the other things that were firsts, especially like Beaver Island and things that surround Strang?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that really I loved was that the first Iron Hull warship, this USS Michigan, this is like, there's actually a good book on the USS Michigan, and it plays into Beaver Island's story more than once. But it's like this high-tech warship that is going around the Great Lakes, and it's a really big deal. And so I guess I don't know if it's the first, but this is pretty much the first quasi-independent kingdom on U.S. soil, right? I mean, I suppose we could count some other things, but it's, you know, I mean, Strang kind of, you know, this is the age of the self-made man, and whether or not you like Strang or believe what he said, he was a brilliant self-made man. This is the great, and you know, I think about it with Lincoln, right? So it's, you know, they're both these country lawyers, both postmasters when they're young, both in their local state legislature, both see a lot of failure, both are called, you know, hucksters and frauds, And, you know, Lincoln goes on to do such good in the world, you know, and Strang doesn't. And I think there's a limitation on Strang's part. But I also just think, I don't know. I mean, I just think Strang was a more limited person than, and less willing to change than Lincoln. Lincoln had this great ability to adapt, not just himself to what other people wanted him to hear, but to adapt himself to the times. And I think Strang was not as good. Yeah. So they were totally contemporary. Yeah, contemporaries. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
The book, The King Strang Story, I found it in our bookshelf and I was looking through it by Doyle Fitzpatrick in 1970. What was his motivation for vindicating Strang?
Well, I'm not sure, because you know, that's the book. So that the King Strang Story is the one that says that the Mormons here were not faultless, but they weren't running a pirate colony, and that it was all a big, it was all people who hated Mormons. I'm not sure his motivation. I think you can see, maybe he just didn't have access to some of the evidence I had access to, or didn't do the research. I mean, it does, some of the stories do seem far-fetched. You know, Strang invaded Chicago, which was a small town then, but it was still a boom town. You know, Strang's men, well, it turns out some of the guys who invaded Chicago went to jail. So, yeah, Strang invaded Chicago. You know, it wasn't him, but he was sending out people to get food and supplies and merchandise. I don't know his, that book really interests me because he's got some, he makes some good points, but I just didn't buy from the start the idea that every newspaper, you know, that every newspaper in the Midwest was making stuff up. Oh, these guys from Beaver Island raided last night and took stuff. I'm sure sometimes, you know, like if you were going to raid a town, you might just say, we're Mormons, by the way, Mormons! You know, so I'm sure there was some of that. But, you know, I mean, I just, you know, for that to be the case all the time, yeah, I think I always thought there was smoke, where there's smoke, there's fire, and it turns out there was fire. Yeah.
What were the other two books that you
So, Vicki Cleverly Speak wrote something, A Kingdom.
God has made us a kingdom.
God has made us a kingdom. It's a really wonderful book, especially about the women at Beaver Island. And then there's Roger Van Noor's book, Assassination of a Michigan King. And then there's Milo Quaif's book, The Kingdom of St. James. Milo, Quaife, is that right? And that book's really interesting because Quaife, we owe so much of our knowledge to him because Quaife was able to not only interview some people, it's written in 1930, I think is the publishing date, some survivors of that period, including survivors of the island, but also to collect this material, you know, as in Salt Lake City, the Mormons are great savers and documenters. So Ancestry.com grows out of Mormon records, right? And so Strang's wives and whatnot saved a lot of documents, and Quaife helped, you know, it wasn't him alone, but he helped bring them together. And so there's this, any of you who are interested in Strang, Yale's Spiney Library has the great collection. And then Central Michigan University has a really cool collection of stuff too.
Which is I'm searching for this book, and it had the stories of a lot of deception, like burying the treasure on the other side of the oak tree, so it could be discovered, you know, digging.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know which book that is. There's also one on sale at the back of the room here. Now I'm spacing your name. Hey, Lori. What?
Yes.
William, what's the woman who wrote about? You've got something in the sea.
The Child of the Sea.
Oh, Child of the Sea.
Elizabeth Whitney Williams.
But a lot of people didn't take her stories. That might be it. That she kind of does this thing where this is so-and-so's story. She was a little girl on the island, and then her family got kicked off. But she kind of does this thing, so-and-so tells this story, and a lot of people dismiss it. I think they dismiss it because she's she's a woman writer. They said, you know, other people say, well, she wasn't there, that's just hearsay. But I think a lot of stuff she said adds up when you start putting the historical pieces together. Who knows? But it's certainly, some of it is legitimate as some of the other indirect stories at the time that have been treated more seriously.
This was I'm sure it was a professor, and we also talked about creating auras, the inner echelon, using sulfur and being out.
Oh yeah, that was a story in Burlington. The question was Strang using, so in Burlington, Wisconsin, he famously held this religious ceremony where people's heads seemed to glow, and it was, he used, what did he use? I can't remember, but some toxic substance. He was caught, and it kind of went bad for him. That was, he started losing a little credibility in town. Yeah. So, any other questions? Anything well, before we go, I have some thank yous that I really would like if you'll indulge me. Oh, first I wanted to just show you, you're the first audience to see this. So my paperback is coming out in September. So so the yellow one or the orange one is the paperback, and I think that I call this the Edgar Allan Poe cover versus the P.T. Barnum cover. So I don't know how I like it, but I think they're trying to make it more menacing. I think that'll sell books. But I would like to just thank Lori Taylor Bliss and the board of the Historical Society, Bobby Welke, and some others for having me up here. It's just such an honor to be here and such a thrill to be here. And I wanted to thank Peter Amster, who lives on the island, or lives part of the time on the island, who did the Zoom thing with me. He was sort of the questioner. He was such a wonderful, gracious host. I want to thank Sue and Chris Screbbins for their hospitality. I also want to thank the late Sandra Birdsong, just acknowledge her, who, when I came here 5 years ago, drove me around the island. It was such a wonderful, informed host, such a fascinating person with such a fascinating life. Her husband wrote me the most beautiful note after the book came out. And finally, I would just like to thank Brendan Altai, who's maybe there somewhere, who's just, so if you get the audio book, it's a very talented actress named Reagan Altai, who does other audiobooks, and she happens to be my wife for 25 years. So I'm glad to sign books. Please, I don't know, I made the bucket disappear, did I? Yeah. Please throw some stuff in that bucket.
Yeah. So, just so that we know how to get out of here and everything's bashful and stuff, I'm going to pull this side door back, and I have some books in there. There's not a whole lot, but I have a few of them for sale, and I see many of you brought their copies. So you'll be able to walk in there, and as we start to walk in there, walk around the corner, come in the side door. That way my boy has a little bit of time to clear those chairs out, so you can walk out the sliding door after you're done. And we have raffle tickets. Like I said, we'd love to get rid of those last 25 raffle tickets. And if you want to buy anything else, there's some other merchandise out there.
And
thank you for coming.
Thank you to the big thank you.